Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Productions. I'm Crown Grays Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if Scotland became independent? Now, as we all ought to know, in 2014 Scotland had a referendum on whether it would remain part of the UK or whether it would go down the independent route, and it lost that vote at 45% for independence and 55% for remaining in the UK. But what if that had gone differently? That's what we're going to look into this video. So first of all, we're going to dive into some of the fundamentals in terms of like the economic situation within Scotland. Then we're going to be looking at how independence would have affected not just Scotland but also the rest of the UK. And then also we're going to be looking at current opinion polls and what the situation is at the moment. And so we're just going to dive straight in. So it's something to note that Scotland makes up 8% of the UK's population but contributes 7% of its GDP. It's also something to note that London itself has a GDP twice the size of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland combined. So just give you an idea of just how dominant like England is here. Like England is almost 80% of the economy of the UK and almost 80% of the GDP of the UK. And England gives far more like to the different constituent nations than it receives in return. So in 2017 to 2018, Scotland per head had a net fiscal deficit of £2,442. So that means that the average Scottish person was receiving on average £2,000 more than they were putting into the UK coffers, right? So, and you see a similar picture for Wales as well. For Wales, it's almost 4,000 per head. And in Northern Ireland, it's almost 5,000 per head. So as a whole, the different constituent nations within the UK are incredibly dependent on England, right? And if you want to really drill into the data even more, you see that of the different regions / nations of the UK, London, the southeast and the east of England are the only regions that contribute more than they receive, so they're the only ones who are net donors, whereas every other region / nation is a net recipient of UK funds. So does that mean necessarily that Scotland would be broke? No, although if we drill into some of this, like we kind of see like just how much they do receive. So England, as with nearly all countries in the world, unfortunately, has a budget deficit. So in 2018, England had a budget deficit of £5.6 billion, which isn't actually like a great deal, especially when you consider that the economy of England is £1.8 trillion. So this represents a figure of 0.3%. However, when it comes to Scotland, we see that they have a total GDP of 168 billion, but the amount that they receive as a net recipients of the UK government, they receive on average 13.3 billion, right? So this represents almost 8% of their entire GDP is money given to them by the British government. What about the situation for Wales? Well, for Wales, we can see that it's 13.7 billion out of a total Welsh GDP of 75 billion. So this represents about 18% of their total GDP. And for Northern Ireland, they receive 9.2 billion out of a total GDP of 56 billion. So this represents 16% of Northern Irish spending. So when we look at it, any country that wants to leave the UK is going to be short of some money, right? Well, with the exception of England, which will obviously be at the gain of quite a few billion. But, in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't make that much of a difference to the English economy. But how much of an effect would it really have on the economy of Scotland? Well, it's not to say that they wouldn't be successful. It's not to say that suddenly they've been plunged into poverty. However, some of the instability from them leaving would certainly, it would certainly affect them, at least in the short term. So, most notably of all is the fact that the UK government has said that, unlike in the case for Ireland, so when the Republic of Ireland left the UK in 1922, from 1922 until 1978, the Irish used the British pound. So this was money controlled directly from the Bank of England, and so they didn't have their own currency as such. They had like a kind of version of it, but mainly it was determined from London, right? So even though they had independence, they still held on to the British pound. But the British government, both at the time of the referendum and since, have said that an independent Scotland would not be able to maintain this monetary union with the rest of the UK. So Scotland would then have to either negotiate with the UK, which, given that the UK, relies on Scotland with regard to holding its Trident nuclear submarines. So these are nuclear submarines which we use as a kind of nuclear deterrent, but because they're all submarine based and the ports in Scotland are the only ones that have the facilities to really house it, it would be quite difficult for them to move to England or to other places in the Union. So so maybe they could kind of do a deal where they could say, you keep like our Trident bases and then we'll allow you to keep the pound or something like that. But if there's no negotiation, then Scotland would either have to create its own currency or it would have to join the euro, which, in spite of how strongly Scotland voted like for remaining in the EU, a lot of people in Scotland do not want to have the euro because obviously they've seen the effect that it's had in many places on the continent. So this would put Scotland in a very awkward position because, first of all, they'd be liable to pay off the debt which is still owed to them as they were under the British, and there'd be less money for pensions. It'd be in the first few years there would be a lot of economic issues because a lot of things would have to be negotiated. Like you'd see a lot of instability in this time, and this would really hurt like kind of Scottish business in the short term. Not to say that long term Scotland would like be a wastebasket and stuff. Of course, like Scotland would do very well as a small country and stuff. But that is something to note, that the first few years of this would be very difficult. And for those of us who have lived through the Brexit Civil War, which is like a video I'm going to do at some point, like documenting the history of like all the goings on of like Brexit from like 2014 to the present. And so definitely check out for that. But like that's going to be nothing in comparison to like how difficult the negotiations are going to be between London and Edinburgh if Scotland ever vote for its independence. Also add to this as well the fact that the EU, as much as Scotland is, it voted 62%, to remain in the EU. So as Europhilic as Scotland is, the rest of the EU is not going to be as happy to admit them into the Union. And this is mainly because, in particular, Belgium and Spain have their own separatist movements, In particular, Flanders, which wants to split away from the rest of Belgium, and Catalonia, which wants to split away from the rest of Spain. And actually, there's a much stronger argument, I'd say, for Catalonian independence than there is for Scottish independence, because Catalonia, unlike Scotland, is a net contributor to the Spanish economy, whereas Scotland is a net recipient. But that being said, like to admit any new country into the EU, it requires the unanimous approval of all states. So if Scotland wanted to be part of the EU, all it would take is for Spain to say no, and then they wouldn't be able to. So does this mean that Scotland would this mean that they'd be kind of out on a limb? Well, not necessarily. They could join EFTA, which is the European Free Trade Agreement, which Norway is part of, Iceland is part of, Switzerland is part of as well. It's quite a good compromise. So they still would be within the single market, and they still would have a certain level of like freedom of movement. They'd be part of Schengen zone potentially. Although then again, the Republic of Ireland isn't part of the Schengen zone, so Scotland could potentially have an opt-out for that. So they still have freedom of movement within the EU, but they just wouldn't be part of the EU customs union, well, unless they chose to kind of be part of that as well, which most likely they would. But Scotland, upon getting independence, would have to spend many years negotiating with Britain, but then also simultaneously, if it wanted to, would have to spend many years also negotiating with the EU to try and join that union. So Scotland becoming independent is not necessarily a straightforward thing. The process in the long and the short of it would probably take, Brexit dragged out for many, many years. I think Scotland, for it to kind of gain its full independence and then to be readmitted into the EU, probably talking a period of probably at least, I'd say maybe 3 years, maybe 2, but I think probably 3, 4, maybe 5 years, maybe. So that's something to kind of bear in mind. And also another thing to bear in mind as well is that Scotland, just like Northern Ireland, is heavily dependent on exports to the UK. So 63% of Scottish exports go to the rest of the UK. And then also a similar situation for Northern Ireland as well. So 60% of their exports go to the rest of the UK. So if Scotland leaves, then the argument for Irish reunification is a lot stronger. But then at the same time, it's also still in that transitionary period, there is a fact of there'd have to be different tariff arrangements. There have to be different, different changes to like kind of freedom of movement across the places as well. And in the short term, at least, the level of exports and imports between Scotland and well, basically England and Wales at that point would be very fraught, basically. And yeah, so it's not as easy as simply, just saying we're independent and then just going off like into the sunset. It's a little bit more complicated. It's not to say that Scotland should not be independent. It's not to say that they couldn't be independent. It's not to say that they'd be dead broke if they were, but it's not going to be a straightforward thing. And there are some things that you have to bear in mind in that process. So where does Scottish public opinion stand at the present time? Well, since the Brexit referendum in 2016, in which England and Wales voted solidly to leave the Union and Scotland voted solidly to remain in the Union, ever since then, Scotland has veered a lot more towards the independent camp, right? So obviously, the SNP is still the dominant party in Scotland, both in terms of Westminster seats and in terms of Holyrood seats, so Holyrood being the Scottish Parliament. And yeah, damn you, ice cream van. It's making a comeback because it's summer now. Anyway, older viewers will know what I'm talking about, yeah, but damn you, ice cream van. Anyway, so on average, we can kind of see that based on a lot of the opinion polls from this year and from last year, we can see, like, if you exclude people who say don't know or like kind of whatever, like kind of, it seems to be around 52%, maybe 53%, like in favour of leaving the Union. So it's, yeah, so Scottish independence, it could like win. However, like closer to the time when, a lot of these issues kind of get brought to bear, it's going to be a lot closer because people are going to have to think about it a lot more. And so whereas at the moment people go, oh yeah, we don't like this current government, and oh yeah, we don't like the fact that we've left the EU, and etc., etc. Getting closer to the time, like looking at the situation as it stands now, it's going to be different. And also as well, something to note is that in 2014 oil prices were much higher, and obviously Scotland had North Sea oil and gas, and yeah, so they kind of benefit a lot from that. However, in the last few years, like the oil prices have tanked, and therefore like a lot of the revenue which they would have got from that, that argument has kind of sailed now. So it's not to say that oil prices can't go up as again, but if you're dependent on that for your economy, like I know obviously Scotland does a lot of other things well, tourism and engineering, etc., but at the same time, if you're expecting oil to basically like kind of like bankroll you, then it's kind of, yeah, you're kind of playing Monopoly with like the world oil prices. So that's something to kind of bear in mind. But even in spite of all of that, when you give people the choice of would you rather have independence or devolution or no parliament at all, in the Scottish Social Attitudes Survey of 2019, yeah, you see 51% being in favour of independence and only 36% being in favour of devolution, with just 7% in favour of no parliament at all. So basically a revert to how things were before 1998. So if you kind of look at it in that way, you can kind of see that the support for independence has really gone up. Yeah, there probably is a lot stronger of an argument for it. A lot of people have said that the Scottish government have handled the coronavirus in a better way than the UK government has, and there's certainly a lot of like public support for the Scottish government. And also in this year, in 2021, the Scottish Parliament are going to have elections in which the SNP are expected to have a majority, and opinion polls have shown that what people are saying is that if a majority of Scots vote for the SNP, which is the Scottish Nationalist Party, then people are saying that there's a strong argument for Westminster to allow there to be a referendum, because this is the important thing. Although there's devolution in the UK government from London, they're the ones who have to approve it. So unless Boris Johnson approves there to be a referendum, which he said that under no circumstances there will be, he said it's a once in a generation thing. However, obviously politicians do change their mind, especially under a lot of public pressure. So yeah, we don't know how it's going to work out, but at least on paper, it's a thing of, yeah, there's a lot of pressure for it to happen, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it necessarily will happen within the lifetime of this parliament. So now that we've looked at how independence would affect Scotland, now let's look at how it would affect the rest of the UK. Now, this is quite difficult because as with all these alternative history ones, as I said before, the most likely thing to have happened is what ended up actually happening. So at that point, the people of Scotland were hesitant about leaving, and they chose, it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't know, right? So they chose to stay within the UK rather than leaving. However, obviously, in the last 7 years, a lot of things have happened, yeah? And, public opinion has really shifted. So when we look at this alternative history, we're going to have to kind of bear a few things in mind, yeah? So we're going to have to run kind of two scenarios. One is where British opinion in the rest of the UK stays the same, and then the other in which people go, eh. So the year after the Scottish referendum, yeah, you had the 2015 general election. And as it stands, the Conservative Party won a majority of seats in England. And, as a result, obviously, won the majority of seats in the rest of the UK because of, obviously how huge England is. So this is the figures for just how England voted, yeah. So England in 2015 voted 41% for the Conservatives and just 31.6% for the Labour Party, which is, the second biggest party. So that's obviously quite a big difference, yeah. And this would have given the Conservative Party 318 seats to Labour's 206. Now, bear in mind that that Scotland has 59 seats, yeah, within the UK Parliament. This would represent 318 out of 591 seats, right? Which is, that's a sizable majority. And obviously in Wales, the Conservatives won 27% to Labour's 37%. And this is just looking at the 2015 election. So things have changed significantly since Brexit, and especially in 2019, things changed quite significantly. So this would have given the Conservatives a grand total of 329 seats out of a total parliament of 591, which would have been roughly about 55 to 56% of the total seats. So it's quite significant. So then the main question becomes, would the Brexit referendum have happened if this had happened? And it's difficult to say because, if it did happen, as our timeline kind of dictates, which is, they won the 2015 election saying that they'd run on a manifesto that would allow there to be a referendum. So if they had to honour that, then there would have been a referendum in 2016, and then the vote would have been even more so towards a leave. That also affects the whole argument with regard to what happened in the Brexit referendum, because a lot of people were saying, oh, it was too close. It's 52 to 48. However, if it's 53 to 47, the argument becomes a little bit weaker because then there's a 6-point gap rather than a 4-point gap. So that's also something to kind of bear in mind as well. However, something that we have to bear in mind though is that, as we say, public opinion, we can't really predict public opinion this time because, if Scotland end up leaving the UK, then David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time, would have been known as the Prime Minister who lost Scotland. So how would that have played out with public opinion? So it's a question of, just how annoyed people would have been. Certainly, as we've seen with Brexit, not so many Conservative voters would actually have been annoyed at it. So if you looked at opinion polls more recently, if there's a choice between losing Scotland or losing Northern Ireland, the Conservative and Unionist Party, which is the official name, most supporters would say, no, we want to have Brexit over Scotland. So a lot of people who you might expect to be annoyed by it would still vote Conservative. So this would just be a question of how many people from who support other parties would have been annoyed by that. And so for this argument, we're going to look at the other branch, which is that as a result of them losing Scotland, public opinion turns against the Conservative Party, and then Ed Miliband, who is the Labour leader, ends up becoming Prime Minister. So if Ed Miliband had won the 2015 election, what would have happened? So first of all, for those who are unaware of British politics, between the period of 2015 to 2019, you had what was known as Corbynism. So Jeremy Corbyn ended up becoming the leader of the Labour Party, and this guy, for American audiences, he's kind of basically Bernie Sanders. He was a British version of Bernie Sanders, and so he was a very strong socialist. So a lot of people within the Labour Party who were fed up of Blair and Brown and Milliband and all these kind of basically centrist people, who in their eyes they kind of see as being on the right, but they were kind of fed up of that, and they wanted someone who was authentically socialist. This caused a lot of divisions within the Labour Party over those years. There was lots of schism, both on a national level and on a local level, with very, very tense meetings and stuff. And I can say this from my own personal experience and stuff. We'll get onto at some later point in terms of my own journey and my own politics, etc., etc. But for now, just know that I lived through that period and was quite heavily involved in that, and it was incredibly tense. And if Miliband had become Prime Minister, I don't think that you would have really had so many divisions, because him losing that election kind of gave a revitalization of like the left within the Labour Party, and yeah, so that's how they end up kind of like taking over the whole party. But if not, you would have still had this kind of general kind of moderate kind of like centrist kind of like policies, and so yeah, you would have a reversal of austerity which the Cameron government had put in place. But then at the same time, like, would Miliband have allowed there to be a referendum? No, like that was what the Labour Party said that they wouldn't allow. So Brexit simply wouldn't have happened, because it happened because, you know, Nigel Farage with the UKIP party, UK Independence Party, you know, they put so much pressure on the Conservative government that it was a thing of, if you don't allow us to have this referendum, then the next election we're coming for you, basically. And a lot of people would have defected, because at that point a lot of people did defect from the Conservative Party to UKIP. However, if the Conservative Party didn't end up getting into office and end up being part of Her Majesty's opposition, then that pressure would have still been there, and you know, they might have been able to take over the Conservative Party, like, you know, in that sense. But it's not as clear cut. I think that if David Cameron had lost that election, there probably would have been a leadership race. And at that point, Boris Johnson, who was still the Mayor of London, probably would have stepped down and then, like, you know, end up becoming the Conservative leader. And obviously, you know, he was very, very popular. And obviously, this is part of why he won the Conservative leadership election so easily in 2019. It also, if you look at some of the statistics as well, like his support for Brexit during the 26th referendum swayed enough Conservative voters where it got it across the line, because people were kind of going, people were umming and ahhing as to whether to support it. And you know, when they saw someone like Boris Johnson, who was like, he had never had much of a reputation for being a staunch like Brexiteer, when even he came out for it, then a lot of people were swayed by that. But I think that Boris Johnson probably would have gone down the Eurosceptic line anyway, because he understood that to win the Conservative leadership, yeah, if he ran as a Brexiteer, then he would end up gaining support. So the next election would have been in 2020. And something to bear in mind as well, obviously, it would have probably been around May time. And obviously, as we now know, the pandemic ended up striking in March. So would the general election have been postponed? Like, it was postponed for the London mayoral one. So that's something to bear in mind. You could, even to this day, have Ed Miliband as the Prime Minister, rather than, you know, going through Theresa May and then Boris Johnson now. So a lot of British politics over the last like 7 years would have been completely different if this had kind of gone down the road. So it's something to kind of bear in mind, that we can't really predict public opinion and how public opinion would have been affected by certain things happening. So, you know, I think probably the most likely thing is that the Conservative Party probably would have won that 2015 election still, in spite of losing Scotland. But at the same time, it's, you know, we don't know. It's too up in the air, and like kind of, and I think that there's any opinion polls I can see on it of what effect like losing Scotland would have had on that election. So if anyone in the comment section can find any, please like kind of like send it to me and stuff, because that'd be really appreciated. But with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, share with your friends, and also watch a great many more of our amazing videos, if I do say so myself, from our many different playlists. And the next video is going to be on what if Britain voted to have proportional representation. So there was a referendum in 2011, which is the AV referendum, and as we've discussed in some of our previous videos, that ended up being lost. However, we're imagining how British politics might be different in this day and age if there had been a vote for an alternative vote. So yeah, that's something to look forward to in the next video. And so with that being said, have a great day and bye.